next up, we have Dr. Shamugam, who will be introduced by Serena.
Hi, so the third speaker for the Humanities Minisymposium is Dr. Priya Shamugam. Dr. Shamugam is a PhD candidate at Harvard University's Economics Department. She researches labor and behavioral economics. Specifically, she examines the effects of cognitive constraints on decision-making in the emergency room. Some of her key research is detailed in her papers: Gender Differences in Learning, Evidence from the Emergency Department, Habit Formation and Technological De-adoption, Decision Fatigue and Not So Grumpy Judges. They explore how gender differences in doctors' self-perception of abilities affect their treatment styles, explain physician habit formation, and use data from the New Hampshire Parole Board to estimate the impact of judges' decision fatigue on parole hearing outcomes. Currently, Dr. Shamugam is working as a researcher in the Health Studies Unit at Mathematica Policy Research. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Shamugam.
Thank you guys for having me. You can hear me okay?
Yes. And you should be able to share your screen.
You what?
Oh, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, let me see if I can do that. Are you seeing the PowerPoint now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. And I apologize in advance if you hear a puppy who is upset that she's not allowed to hang out with me right now. We're still working on boundaries. But thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my research and the research of others in the same area, which is on using big data to understand physician decision-making, which is my area specifically, and also just understanding important questions in healthcare more broadly. So if I were to make a pitch for why someone at the undergrad level should get excited about doing research in the area of health economics, I would say, first of all, there are just tons of questions out there. I am always surprised when I'm confronted by how little we know about a system that is so important. For example, there are so many causes of racial bias in the healthcare system. You hear stories about them very frequently, but we still don't have a good sense of why those problems occur and what solutions would be effective in fixing them. Going along with that, we just simply don't know which policies work best and which don't. I mean, there's constantly the most prominent debate is the debate about how best to ensure Americans who need healthcare, but we still don't have a good consensus on how to best and most effectively do that. When we compare the US to other countries, we know that healthcare costs are much higher here, and surprisingly, quality tends to be lower. But if you hear from opponents of universal healthcare here, they often point to the fact that there are crowding problems with the healthcare systems in other countries. So if you compare us to a place like the UK, where they have the national health system, you can wait months to get an appointment there, whereas here you can get one more easily. So which one of those things is really better? They're very different ways of doing things, and we still don't know which is really, really the best way to do it. Even within the US, our healthcare system is actually a patchwork of very, very different types and levels of efficiency. So if you are having knee problems in one part of the US, that could result in a total knee replacement. Whereas in another part of the US, you might just get referred to a physical therapist and have that problem managed through therapy and non-surgical methods. Those two paths result in very different outcomes, very different costs. And we don't really know why doctors in one area do one thing and the other area do a different thing, and which one is better, and why don't they all do the thing that's better. And then of course, the question that's probably most interesting to me is the fact that we have these high stakes, literally life or death decisions sometimes that are being made by human beings. So they have to take into account tons and tons of information. They have to make these very important choices, and it's all sort of happening inside their head. I think that phenomenon applies in lots of different areas. So, you have judges making decisions about who to put in jail and who to let out. It's a ton of information being made by one person instead of, say, a computer or a panel of people or one person with lots of time on their hands. So I think there are just a lot of things that can go wrong there, or at least be very interesting. If you take the quirks from behavioral economics and imagine where they have the highest consequences, I think that is in the realm of healthcare, which is why I sort of am interested in putting those two together and understanding their consequences. So there are lots of questions, but the great thing is that there's lots of data in healthcare too. So of course there's claims. Every time you go and you even need a Band-Aid, there's a bill for it, and all those bills are stored somewhere, and researchers can actually access them and learn a lot about, okay, who's getting a total knee replacement versus who's just getting physical therapy. With the rise of electronic health records, these computers that are there to help doctors take note of everything that they're seeing, you now have all those notes that are stored in these huge databases and timestamps and each test that's ordered. So the electronic health records store tons and tons and tons of data in them. And our computers are speeding up as well, so we can now take all that data and actually learn from it. The growth of social media has led to whole forms of social media that are just for doctors. There's a platform called Doximity, where you can just figure out which are the doctors in your area. And researchers have used websites like that to try and figure out where there are shortages and surpluses of doctors. There are, of course, vital statistics of all kinds. I mean, because of the pandemic, a lot of that has become more prominent, but there's data that's just keeping track of how many people are dying every day, how many people are showing up in the emergency room every day with what kinds of symptoms. And we can actually look at those as early indicators of the pandemic. So those are becoming more important, even though they've been around for a long time. And then there's also social media for patients. There's a lot of talk about how we can use things like Twitter and Facebook and even Google to try and detect, a mental health event before it happens, or a heart attack before it actually happens. So there are symptoms that are probably occurring before, and our usage of the internet might lead to a very interesting footprint that you could use to sort of intervene very early in these things. And of course, I think of wearables as another really exciting example of how there's just more and more and more data related to health. So everybody who's wearing a Fitbit, or everybody who has like a smartwatch or something like that, we now have their heart rate data and their stress levels and things like that. So I think, even though I just mentioned all the questions and how little we know, I think there's so much data out there that is just going to kind of keep increasing our ability to answer those questions. And of course, that means that it requires more people who have an interest. So I think that's why, yes, I think it's a good thing to investigate and see if it interests you. So I thought I would just highlight a few exciting examples of work that other people, very established health economists have done, as well as highlight a couple of papers that I'm currently working on that I think show you kind of a whole span of things that you could use your research skills to try and contribute to. So the first paper is a really interesting paper. I think is very, very relevant, especially now. It's called, "Does Diversity Lead to Better Health?" And if you Google it, there's a publicly available version of the paper that you can read for free. And I think actually, if you have an academic email address, you can go to the NBER, which is the National Bureau of Economic Research, and you can request any of the papers that are hosted on there for free, because you have an academic email address. So if you are interested in reading any of these papers, most of the ones that I'm going to discuss, not my own because I'm not a professor, but most of these are on there. So this is a really interesting paper, and the authors are all health economists, doctors, economists, some combination of those things. And to write this paper, they actually started their own flu clinic in Oakland in order to write the paper. And they basically wanted to understand whether, if you are a Black patient and you have a Black doctor, is that really gonna improve things? We know from talking to activists and people who are on the ground in these situations that diversity in healthcare is a problem, as it is in many spaces, but we didn't have the hard proof. And that's one caveat that I'll add in some of these papers, is that often the title makes it seem like this is maybe not something that the authors believed, but I think often, at least in the case with economics, it's more of a question of saying, we think that this thing is important, but we don't have hard proof. We don't have proof in the form of like lots and lots of data. So let's try and run an experiment and complement what we already know from talking to people about their lived experiences. So for this, they literally formed a flu clinic in Oakland from the ground up, recruited doctors, Black doctors, white doctors, male and female, and then tried to say, okay, what happens if I randomly assign a white patient to get a white doctor or a Black doctor, and a Black patient to get a white doctor or a Black doctor? And we're specifically going to see what happens to if we can convince you to get a flu shot, which is obviously, given that we're in a pandemic, you know how important these simple preventative actions are. And basically they show that if a Black patient randomly gets a Black doctor, they are way, way, way more likely to get their flu shot. That's likely because they have more trust, they have better communication. Literally, they track the length of the visit with the doctor, and those visits were longer, likely because communication and trust were better. And on the other side, not that it was a specific concern, but sort of just to nail down any last opposition, they show that there's no difference for white patients. So for white patients, it's fine. Whichever doctor you get is going to be great. However, if you're a Black patient, really having diversity in the workforce is super important for you. And so that should be a priority, you know, on a national scale. And so this is a very work intensive, but interesting and hard to argue against way of proving that fact. So this is one paper that I really enjoy, and sort of takes health econ questions and applies them to a racial justice question. This next one I think is also rather interesting. It basically tries to figure out what's wrong with our healthcare system by comparing it to another healthcare system where many of the same features don't exist. So for pet healthcare, you don't have any involvement from the government at all, right? There's no government provided product. There's also no malpractice, because in most states, pets are not treated the same way human beings are. So if you sue a vet for damage to a pet, you almost can't get anything for that, because pets are considered legally, they're considered to be property, you know, instead of living things. So Amy Finkelstein and Liran Ainov take data on spending for pet healthcare and pet health insurance and try and understand if it works the same way. And weirdly, it does. So you have the highest spending at the end of life, and you have a lot more spending if you're you have higher income. And there's a lot of variation across the country in what different types of vets will do for the same problem. So weirdly, they actually find a lot of similarities, even though the structures of these two systems are very, very different. But that, I think, is an interesting one, because it just takes a very creative approach to trying to understand why our healthcare system is so weird. Let's see. Oh, okay. And one more, also sort of applying a social justice lens to questions in health economics. So this one is called Dissecting Racial Bias in an Algorithm Used to Manage the Health of Populations. And this was recently published in Science magazine, I think. So it's by Sendhil Mullainathan and some of his co-authors. Sendhil Mullainathan, you may find his name familiar because he wrote a very famous paper called Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal? And that was the really famous resume study where they created thousands and thousands of fake resumes that were identical, save for the name of the person on the resume. And so they chose stereotypically white names versus stereotypically Black names. They mailed them out to thousands and thousands of employers. They tried to see if there were any differences in the callback and job offer rates. And of course, there were huge effects. So it's sort of a stunning display of the prevalence of racism in a very high stakes setting, which is hiring. So that is the background on some of Sendhil's work, which is very exciting. So in this new work, he turns to what happens when racism enters an algorithm. So this is a very modern question. You know, we're having algorithms play a larger and larger role in healthcare. Given that I'm interested in how human decision makers often get it wrong, you would think the inclusion of an algorithm by computer would be a good thing. But in this case, they actually show how the algorithms make the errors that human beings make even worse. So basically, the example is there's a healthcare algorithm that tries to identify which patients are the sickest to refer them to further resources. But the way that they identify the patients that are the sickest is by identifying the patients that are the most expensive. However, if you pair that with the fact that often Black patients are overlooked and don't receive the healthcare that they need, what ends up happening is that Black patients become less expensive than white patients because they're receiving less care. So then when the algorithm is looking for which patient is the unhealthiest and who needs the most support, they end up looking for the most expensive patients, which tend to be the white patients rather than the sickest patients, some of whom are actually the Black patients. So they took very confidential data from a large healthcare management company, found that this was happening. And the happy ending is that the company was actually very motivated to then work with them to rework their algorithm to go off of strict health indicators rather than cost indicators, which is where the problem was coming in. So this is actually a very fixable problem. And Sendhil has a really nice op-ed in the New York Times called "Biased Algorithms Are Easier to Fix Than Biased People," which I think is a nice way of spinning this result. It shows that with an algorithm, you usually don't have a person that you're up against. If you can fix how the algorithm works, sometimes it's easier than fixing how a person works. So it's another interesting example of kind of applying a big data approach to a really interesting and timely question. All right, so now I'm going to turn to some of my work, which is certainly a lot more in development, but very much in the same spirit. So sorry, the puppy is very upset. My dissertation was on what happens when doctors are making choices in an emergency room that's very, very crowded. This is, of course, a very common problem. Emergency rooms make up kind of most of the safety net in healthcare because they're actually one of the few places where someone can get care regardless of ability to pay. So as a result, you've got lots of people coming to the emergency room. And also there's this other feature that doctors have to handle all the traffic at the same time. So if somebody's having a heart attack and someone else just was in a car accident, doctors kind of have to manage that all at once. They can't just say, come back later, unless you have like a skin rash or something. And then they do tell you to wait 10 hours. But for the most part, the emergencies have to be handled now because they're emergencies. So it's a really interesting situation in which we get to understand what happens when high stakes decision makers have too much to think about and they've got to make it simpler somehow. And so what I did in my dissertation was I took administrative data covering all emergency room visits occurring in the state of New York between 2005 and 2015. So that's about 60 million visits. It was a huge data set. And I basically compared the outcomes of individuals who happened to visit with an emergency when the ER was very crowded versus when it was very empty. And conditional on a few different assumptions, that's actually pretty random. So it almost works like a natural experiment. We can say, I think any differences that I observe here are going to be because of the crowding and not because of some patient characteristics. This is almost going to work like an experiment because the ER is very random. And so I'll just quickly try and summarize one of the key results, which is that surprisingly, the quality of care actually improves when the emergency room is pretty crowded, specifically along the dimension of how fair it is. So in this graph, the x-axis is your age, and then, the y-axis is your age, and then the x-axis is the effect of your age on how likely you are to be admitted into the hospital, meaning you had a series of problem that you get an overnight bed. And the purple dots are for patients with insurance, and the yellow dots are for patients without insurance. So obviously, for the purple dots, we could see the older that you are, the more likely you are to be admitted, which makes sense, because if you're older, your symptoms are more likely indicative of a serious problem, which requires intensive supervision. Whereas if you're not insured, there actually doesn't seem to be a gradient at all. You can be very old and you can still not be admitted at all versus very young. There's not that much of a difference. However, as the emergency room gets more crowded, as those yellow dots become bigger, we actually do start to see an age gradient. So doctors do start taking into account your age if you are an uninsured patient, whereas they didn't seem to take it into account when the emergency room was very empty. So there seems to be a focusing effect here. When the ER is very crowded, doctors have to focus on what matters at the expense of what doesn't matter. So you start focusing more on things like age and less on things like whether or not you have insurance, which is actually pretty good. I mean, it's pretty good if you think that health is the most important. Obviously, it's not very good if you think that costs are important or, you know, the hospital's bottom line. But that brings us back to the question of whether or not doctors should have been asked to focus on both of those things at once. So clearly, when the emergency room gets more crowded, they focus on one at the expense of the other. The work is a lot more detailed than that, but I thought I would just highlight kind of this one main result to show that sometimes you can delve into this work and then find the answers to be actually rather counterintuitive, and they can take a lot longer to understand, but I guess that's where it's interesting. And then I'll quickly highlight one other piece of work that is also in progress. This relates more to gender, which is another kind of, I think, exciting thing to consider in any setting. And this is on whether male and female physicians perceive and learn from their mistakes differently. So there's a lot of evidence that male and female physicians get paid different amounts. They spend different amounts of time in patient care. They often achieve different outcomes. And so in this paper, I tried to understand whether learning from their mistakes could be one way in which those differences occur. So again, we rely on the emergency room being kind of a random place to see what happens if you're a male or a female physician and you get paired up with someone in the emergency room and they die on the table in front of you. So likely they came in with a heart attack or something like that, and they die while they are under your care. So the gray bars are for male physicians and the black bars are for female physicians. The x-axis is the months before or after you experience that patient death. And then the y-axis is the age of your discharged patients. It's a bit complicated, but basically you can think of it as a measure of how risky that doctor is willing to be. So the takeaway here is that male doctors continue to be about as risky as they were before the death as after the death, whereas female physicians become significantly less risky right after a death, because you can see that one black dot right after the red dashed line is far below where it is for the associated gray dot. So there's a lot more work on that, but basically female physicians seem to react a lot more to when their patients experience adverse outcomes. That could have consequences for costs, for quality, for learning, for the implications of gender diversity in the workforce, many, many implications. So I think it's another interesting example where you can use sort of all the data that is available, as well as the way in which the system is set up to sort of answer interesting questions that have implications across the board. All right, so if this is work that interests you, I think the great news, as I said, is there are tons of questions, there's lots of data, and so accordingly, there are lots of opportunities to get involved. If you're listening to this talk, given the name of the organization, I assume that means that you're already likely excited about doing research in some form. Maybe grad school is a consideration in the future, all of which is great. And I think the good thing to know is that there are many routes after that. So of course, if you want to become an academic, that would mean that you would do teaching as well as your own research. It's a very self-determined career path. So at any point you get to decide which questions are interesting to you and how you want to answer them. Of course, the client in that situation or the people evaluating your work are going to be other academics. And that means that you will mostly be communicating your work through academic publications that are read by other academics. If you want to work in the policy sector, which is where I work at Mathematical Policy Research as a health studies economist. You'll be working with external stakeholders to develop questions and ways of answering them. So we will work with the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services on, how to reduce costs, or a state healthcare foundation on coming up with a way to deliver medically tailored meals to patients with diabetes or something. There, it definitely feels like more of a team effort. You're working with a client to come up with a question and a way of studying it. The great thing is that you get to see the impact up close. So since the client asked you to research something and find an answer, you get to see them implement that stuff fairly quickly. Whereas with an academic publication, it can often take a little longer for that to translate to a change in the real world. And then obviously there are also many, many opportunities to work in the private sector on stuff like this. Many of the new sources of data that I mentioned, want data scientists and researchers in-house, trying to figure out how that data can be most useful. So obviously there you're working on a product team that has goals related to making that product successful. However, I think one of the most exciting parts of working in a place like that is that you get to, I think, see the quickest effects of your work, and you get to work on things that are very, very current, that move fast. And so that is inherently very exciting. So I think if you're interested in research broadly or anything related to combining interesting questions in healthcare, possibly with topics in decision making or anything like that, I think there are a lot of opportunities. It's a very ripe area. And yeah, I think the future is bright for this subfield. So I'll end there. I think I'm a little early, but better early than late, I guess. So I'll hand it back to you guys, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Priya. Give me just a second. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Questions for Priya will be taken at the very end of the Humanities Minisymposium, along with our final speaker, Mr. Della Rosa, in addition to Dr. Casasanto.